crossing the southern border are detained until they are either deported, released on bond to pursue their immigration claims remotely, or prevail on their pending immigration claims, which they pursue while detained. The average age of the children at the facility is 6 years old, but there are children as young as infants and children as old, or I would say adolescents as old as 16 years old. But as I said, the average age is about 6 years old. Why did we decide to go? So we heard about what was happening, and there was a lot of talk among advocates and human rights organizations about the inhumane conditions and the treatment of the women and children being held at the facility. There was a lot of news surrounding this issue, and with an interest in these sort of issues, it was sort of something that we had been thinking a lot about and had an interest in learning more about. It seemed kind of contrary to American values to have women and children detained in a jail in our country, so we wanted to see what was really happening there. And how did we make this happen? We already kind of had a background knowledge of what was happening, but then Anna Welch, the director of the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic, started to reach out to her colleagues and her network of immigration attorneys and professors, and started to kind of probe the idea of sending students to the Artesia Center to volunteer. At that time, there was only one other clinic program that had even kind of considered the idea of sending volunteers. So Laura and I were actually one of the first groups of students to travel to the center. And what's unique about our experience and the need for attorneys on the ground in Artesia is that individuals, law students, and attorneys who might not necessarily have a background in immigration can still be very useful and needed, and who make a significant difference in the process of the cases of the people there. So we needed the money to be able to do it, and we began our own fundraising efforts. We just started to reach out to students, colleagues, individuals that might have an interest in what we were doing, and actually a lot of the donors are here today, so thank you so much for making this happen for us. We couldn't have done it without you.
Yeah, and for anyone who's interested in going, it is completely possible to save money in a lot of areas and go pretty cheaply fundraise. And for attorneys who might be interested in going, there are a lot of programs where you can get costs covered, like hotel costs and flight costs. So it is completely possible.
So we're going to show you a short clip, and it just kind of gives you an idea about why this sort of phenomenon is happening in our country.
Vengo mi país es El Salvador. Yo cuando tuve la oportunidad de venir acá tenía 17 años. Vengo de un país donde se vive mucha violencia, especialmente por las pandillas. Un muchacho de esos me siguió desde la estación del bus donde yo me bajaba para ya entrar a mi casa. Él dijo que yo tenía que ser para él. Él se quedaba frente a la casa y a veces pasaba todo el día ahí parado, esperando tal vez a que yo saliera, y por temor no salía de mi casa.
There is definitely an increase in children coming from 3 countries, from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And that is, at least in large part, a product of a humanitarian crisis that is happening in those countries because of substantial increases in violence, in the activity of the gangs and drug-related violence that the governments of those countries have not been able to control.
Y si tú no te dejas, pues ellos te secuestran y te violan, te matan.
The gangs control the territory in that area, and they threaten someone, an uncle or sister. They have the ability to kill those people, and they do it on a routine basis.
Estaban ellas siendo
Why have these family jails recently been established in our country? You've heard, some of the reasons, some of the driving forces behind it, but you might might have heard in the last year, in 2014, there was an extreme change in the migration patterns in our country. There was an increase in unaccompanied children crossing the southern border, an increase of mothers traveling with their children across the southern border. And for the first time in history, there were more Central Americans crossing the border than Mexicans. The countries that these individuals were coming from were mostly Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, as opposed to Mexico, as has been in the past. And what's the explanation for that? Why the increase from Central America? You saw some of the reasons in that clip, but there's been a significant increase in gang violence and control in Central America and Mexico. Honduras has the highest murder rate in the world. Guatemala and El Salvador are in the top 5 for murder rates. And a lot of these themes are kind of overlapping. So there might be a situation where domestic violence, gang violence, and police corruption kind of all play into the same narrative. For example, there was a woman that I talked to who had been enduring domestic violence at the hands of her husband for some time. But when he joined a gang, weapons and guns started to appear in her house. She started to receive threats from gang members. And she was told by her husband that, if she were to leave him, then the gangs would find her wherever she went and would kill her at his request. She had thought about leaving for some time, but it was finally, there was kind of an escalating event that really was the game changer for her when the gang started to follow her children home from school. And instead of retaliating against the gangs, the father, who was also involved in this gang, took a machete and chased his daughter down the street with a machete, trying to kill her, blaming her for the attention that she was receiving from the gangs. So it was at that point that the mother decided, I have to leave, and there wasn't much forethought involved. So as you can see, there's some overlapping themes, and a lot of times, even though there are, obviously police forces present, they're non-responsive to a lot of these issues. Domestic violence isn't taken seriously in a lot of these countries, and on top of that, a lot of the police and the gangs are intertwined. So either the police are working with the gangs, or will accept bribes from the gangs in order to allow these individuals to not properly be punished for their crimes.
And also, a lot of the times the police are just afraid to do anything because they think the gangs will then retaliate against them. So I think it's a multitude of factors contributing to the huge amount of impunity, corruption.
So why the United States? Why can't they go somewhere else? This is a question we've heard time and time again in the news and elsewhere. And as I said, these gangs that are present in Central America and Mexico, they're widespread. So even if an individual were to go to a different part of the country, the gang presence is still there and they can still be found. More so, a lot of these individuals, the only other family they have besides the family they have in their home country is in the United States. So, the choice of moving to a new country that they've never been to before, that they have no resources, no acquaintances, no family, no structure whatsoever, or taking the support of a family member in the United States who's offered them help in this process of fleeing for their lives, that often is the better option. And as I said, there's not a lot of forethought that goes into this. A lot of the time, the decisions are made without a lot of planning, and people are forced to leave their possessions behind, their businesses behind, their immediate families behind, to go to a new place where at least they have some sort of support that they can get their feet on the ground.
So another question that we hear pretty frequently is, why can't these individuals come to the United States through other legal channels? And it can be extremely difficult to get a visa to come to the United States, whether it's a temporary or permanent visa. Travel visas are generally only available to individuals from certain countries, and unfortunately it's just almost impossible for Central Americans to get a travel visa to even come to the United States for a couple of weeks. As far as more permanent visas, such as family visas, these oftentimes have really high wait times, or they're also only available for certain kinds of relationships. So, for example, currently, if you are a U.S. citizen and you have an adult child living in Mexico, those types of applications are currently being processed from 1994. So if you applied for your adult child from Mexico to come to the United States with you, they've been waiting for 20 years. And sometimes you just don't have the right kind of relationship to get any sort of valid family visa. So, for example, if your sister is a lawful permanent resident in the United States, there's no visa for siblings of permanent residents. So there's no way to even get in a line. Similarly, employment visas usually require that you're working with an employer, that you have a specific set of skills, and they're also a pretty time-consuming process. So because, again, how Amber mentioned that people put very little forethought, have very little time to be able to come to the United States, it's just not possible for them to get these other types of avenues into the United States. It's just visas. So what was the government's response to this change in migration patterns? Well, they have greatly increased the use of family detention centers. So a little bit of history about family detention in the United States. In the past, there have only been 2 family detention centers in the United States, one which opened in 2001. And it's pretty small. It was in Pennsylvania, and it was really used primarily for individuals who didn't have, or families who didn't have family members or friends in the United States that they could stay with. So because they didn't have anywhere to go, anyone to be released to, they were kept in this detention center. Then in 2006, the government opened Pado, which was forced to be closed in 2009 because of the severe violations that were taking place. The conditions were just really awful in this detention center. No medical treatment. There was no schooling available for children. It's really widespread sickness, and therefore, due to multiple lawsuits, it was forced to be closed in 2009. And at that point, it seemed that the government was going to back away from using family detention. However, after the change in migration in 2014, it seemed there was a lot of pressure on the Obama administration to do something about it. So what they did was open these new family detention centers. Artesia was opened, and then Carnes shortly after, and now the Dilly Center has been opened, which has capacity for 2,400 people. Another important point to make about immigration detention is that immigration detention is considered civil detention. It's really only supposed to be to ensure that people go to their immigration hearings and follow immigration laws. It's not supposed to be punishment. Therefore, none of the individuals receive any of the due process protections or constitutional protections that we see in criminal settings. So, for example, there's no requirement that they be given a lawyer or any of the other due process protections.
So, as I said, these are considered to be holding facilities, but really what we saw while we were there is that they're equivalent to jails. In fact, some of the volunteer attorneys that were with us had worked for the DA's office, the AG's office for several years, and said that the conditions that they witnessed at the Artesia Center was worse than some of the prisons that they had been to. So the kind of nature of the facility is more like a jail than a holding facility. And you can see, this is a picture of the barbed wire fence that surrounds the facility. There's guards at every entrance. Anytime a woman would come to meet with legal counsel, she would be escorted by a guard to the legal trailer and had to sign in, sign out. And every time we would enter the facility, identification, the guard, we were only allowed to see one very small section of the facility, which was where we would meet with clients. But every other part of the facility we weren't permitted to see. So there's no pictures or video or anything else of where these individuals are sleeping, where they're eating, where they're receiving medical care, and we were not permitted to see that part of the facility, which is kind of jarring to think that there isn't that sort of open access to knowledge. As we mentioned, the facility is very remote. It's 4 hours from the nearest city, so it's very isolated. desolate in the surrounding area. Physical illness was a huge issue, and this was something that we saw from the very first minute stepping into the legal trailer in the facility. We saw a mother escorting her young child, her son, who leaned over the trash can to vomit, and amongst everybody else there. It was just child after child had a cough. Everybody was sick. The mothers were reporting that their children, as young as 5 years old, had lost a significant amount of weight since being in the facility. We're talking, 5 to 10 pounds in just a couple of months. For a 5-year-old, that's a really substantial amount of weight. And we were also told time and time again that the medical conditions weren't properly attended to, and would be dismissed and not given kind of the proper care that they should have been given. I also personally was interpreting for a psychiatrist for 2 days. I saw about probably 10 clients back to back that I was interpreting for in their psychological evaluations, specifically the women that had been there for extended periods of time, anywhere from 3 to 5 months, close to 6 months. And you could just see a huge decline in the psychological well-being of the women and the children being detained the longer they were in detention. One really kind of shocking example would be this young girl. She was 3 years old. She had begun to scratch herself and tell her mother that she wanted to die, that she wanted to kill herself. The kind of notion that a 3-year-old could have those kind of thoughts is really just sort of shocking, and goes to the fact that these facilities are not conducive to the goals that the government's trying to achieve, but more so that they're really inhumane and should not have a place in this country. There's also the treatment by the guards. Although it had improved slightly over time since the facility opened, we did witness, guards would be shouting at the women for just something as simple as asking to go to the bathroom. And as Laura said, these are civil proceedings. The detention is not meant to be punitive in nature. It's not meant to be a form of punishment, although you see much to the contrary. You see women and children treated as criminals.
Yeah, and so I think in the beginning, especially, where these guards had, the family detention had not really had a place in our country, and a lot of these guards had been in all-male prisons, and they just didn't know how to change their behavior towards dealing in situations of mothers and children, and I think a lot of the treatment was due to that fact.
And one other point that I forgot to mention that was especially concerning about this facility is that in the legal trailer where the women would meet with counsel, they would have their children with them. So they were often telling us their stories of trauma in front of their children, talking about rape and extreme levels of violence, and their children are watching them recount this. So it's wrong. I don't know how else to say it.
So Amber mentioned how Artesia is located about 4 hours from the nearest local city. In the beginning, guards were literally giving women pieces of paper that said 3 names of attorneys in El Paso, a city which is 4 hours from Artesia. None of these attorneys in El Paso were going to be able to provide much help to the women in the center. So in July 2014, advocates started flying in from all over the country to organize an effort to provide representation to these women and children. In the beginning, it was really difficult for them to provide any sort of meaningful representation. They weren't getting information about who was even in the detention center, how many people were there, when people had hearings, what was happening with their cases. Eventually, through their strong advocacy, they were able to get a space to work in the center, a legal trailer, resources, coordinate to have different volunteers coming in every week, and things started to improve greatly, especially once they were able to start informing the women and children of their rights and of what the immigration law actually is. Things started to improve significantly. So we're going to show a short clip of just one one of the first volunteers who went to the center. This clip is from August, so pretty shortly after volunteers started going.
A group of lawyers is charging immigration officials with violating the due process rights of detainees held at a New Mexico detention center. They filed a lawsuit against the federal government Friday. Special correspondent Kathy McCleary talked with one of the attorneys offering free legal services at the facility before the suit was filed. It's part of our series of conversations with those on the front lines of the immigration crisis.
This is the third time in less than a month that Laura Lichter has driven nearly 550 miles from her home in Denver to Artesia in southeastern New Mexico. She comes at her own expense, and a hotel stay in this oil town isn't cheap, upwards of $150 a night. Gas and meals all add up. Plus, the 47-year-old lawyer has left behind an immigration practice in Colorado, where an hour of her time can cost $300 or more. She's the immediate past president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Lichter shows up at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center at 7 a.m., ready to meet with clients she barely knows and whom she charges nothing. There are women and children who tried to enter the U.S. illegally, were captured at the border and sent here. Most are making claims of asylum. When in Artesia, Lichter works a 15-hour day, culminating with an evening session at a local church where the pro bono attorneys share stories.
So you can kind of see there a little bit of the town area around the center, and just basically the amazing advocate response that took place when people first started going to volunteer. Amber and I were both really amazed at all of the volunteers and their dedication to the project. And again, like the video said, this woman has her own immigration practice, and she's still going multiple times to volunteer to help these individuals because they have no one else. So.
And that was what was really surprising to us, was to see kind of the response from advocates flying in from all over the country to dedicate their time, leave their firms. Some of them were partners in their firms and were, planned on coming for a week, ended up staying a month, and had returned already multiple times. So there's clearly, something going on here that has triggered the need for these advocates to really respond to the situation that's happening.
Another thing that we noticed while we were in Artesia was not only the response of the advocates, but the local community. So while we were there was a candlelight vigil that took place one night where there were members of the ACLU and lawyers who were there volunteering that went, but the majority of the people that were there were just members of the local community who were unhappy with what was happening inside the detention center. And they didn't know the people inside, they didn't have any personal connections, but they just didn't feel that what was happening was right. So these are some pictures of the candlelight vigil and the posters that they handed out. And, so you kind of heard a little bit from the video about what a typical day in Artesia volunteering was like. It's really long, intense, stressful, but rewarding at the same time. We generally be at the center by 7 o'clock a.m. and the night before, all the volunteers would make a list of all the clients who needed to be seen the next day, including all the clients with hearings, and we had to get through that list. So sometimes there were more than 100 people that had to be seen. Only some of them had hearings, but some of them had to be seen for other reasons. And organization was really key, because if anyone was left off of that list the night before, you probably wouldn't be able to see them the next day. So we generally spent our days trying to get through seeing as many clients as possible, helping them. Some of them had to start filling out their asylum applications if they had been there longer, or preparing for their bond hearings, really just whatever was needed. And most of our work actually was geared towards bond hearings. So So generally in the United States, as long as individuals don't have a criminal history, and if they have a family member or friend to stay with, then they can get out on immigration bond. However, this was not always the case in Artesia. A lot of the women, well, all of the women that we saw had no criminal histories, and almost all of them had family members, if not friends, that they could stay with. But they were still being denied bond or given astronomically high bonds. And the result was that they couldn't get out of detention. They were stuck there. And the women that took it the worst, I think Amber talked a little bit about this, but the ones that took it the worst were the ones who got there first. So in the beginning, different judges were presiding over these hearings, judges from Virginia, and they were setting bonds of $20,000 or $30,000 for these individuals without reason. They were literally, the government attorneys and the judges would just be reading from a script about why they were denying bond or setting it so high. There was no individual determination. It was kind of ridiculous. But eventually they did manage to change the venue to Colorado, and things got slightly better, but still seeing really high bonds that a lot of people just couldn't pay. And an interesting statistic is that while we were there, there was over a 6-week time period, people noted that of the people in the facility, about half were released, about half were kept in the facility, but only 3% were deported home. So if you're not deported home, then that means that you have a good chance of winning your asylum claim. So about half of the women and children had a good chance of winning their asylum claim, but still weren't let out on bond.
So what is the government's justification for continuing to detain these individuals who have been determined to have legitimate asylum claims? Laura and I had to learn pretty quickly what their arguments were, because we were representing the women in their bond hearings. So we had to come up with arguments to rebut the government's assertions. And the two main assertions that the government made to justify keeping these women and their children in detention was that the first one was that they posed a national security threat, which when you're sitting next to a mother and her toddler in her lap, her toddler holding a stuffed animal, it's kind of absurd to, kind of make the assertion that this woman and her child are dangerous to the communities that they will be released into. As Laura said, there's no criminal history, and they're being released to pursue their asylum claims. So that argument was really hard for us to comprehend, but the government attorneys would sit there and make that argument with a completely straight face time and time again. And the second argument that would be made was that we need to detain these individuals as a means of deterrence. What we're seeing here is chain migration, and we need to deter others from following their footsteps and doing the same thing. That argument is flawed in some respects, because what the government is essentially saying is we need to punish these individuals for the future hypothetical acts of other individuals, which is kind of contrary to our justice system. And also the fact that it's been recognized that many of these women and children, most of these women and children, have legitimate asylum claims. So we're essentially giving these individuals a death sentence by saying, by the act of deterrence. Laura's going to play a short clip just of that same attorney talking about her experience in these bond hearings and the argument that these are economic migrants as opposed to asylum seekers.
Gang. U.S. officials are saying that a lot of these women and children are economic migrants, or they've come here because they think that they're not going to be sent home. I find this ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous. There's a bias against these women, that the people who are entering on the southern border right now in this humanitarian crisis are all economic migrants, that they're here because they want to work, not because they're running away from something. And nothing could be farther from the truth. It is so bizarre to see a government attorney arguing that the young mother next to you and her 7-year-old and her 3-year-old are a national security threat.
because somehow the government thinks that if any one of these women escape from this institution by being able to pay a reasonable bond, that somehow that means that more people will come.
Is there something different happening here in terms of the speed of the process?
If you're an immigration lawyer, this is kind of like watching Hurricane Katrina happen. I have never seen a process where the government was so hell-bent on moving people through a process, just completely pro forma, like a matter of checking boxes, with the assumption that nobody here has a real case, and that we just need to run them through.
So you can see that we're not the first advocates on the scene to have this kind of reaction to the assertions that were going on there. And both Laura and I have a number of stories of kind of really sort of shocking moments going back and forth with the government attorneys, but Laura has one that's especially powerful.
Yeah, so I just want to share one story for the moment when I really just realized how ruthless the government attorneys were, and again, how arbitrary the process was of just checking boxes. I was representing one woman from El Salvador in her bond hearing, and this woman had come to the United States fleeing gang violence. Again, she had been extorted for several months prior to her departure for money, and then when she couldn't pay, they threatened to kill her. This woman had 2 children, but because she was leaving so suddenly, the people that were helping her leave told her that she could only bring one. And she chose to bring her 2-year-old son, and she left her 4-year-old daughter with her parents in El Salvador. And when I was talking to her before the hearing, I could tell just how guilty and ashamed she felt about the fact that she had left her daughter behind, like I think any mother would, but that she just really didn't have an option. And as soon as the government attorney found out that she had left the daughter behind, they chose to use this to their advantage in a multitude of ways. So they started a line of questioning about whether or not if she didn't, what she would do, basically. Is she going to go home to be with her daughter? Well, no, of course not. She would be killed, and the government attorney was hoping she would say yes to undermine her asylum claim. Then they started asking, well, are you going to bring your daughter here? And the woman had a perfect response, if I get papers and the government allows me to, then yes, I will bring my daughter here. But the government attorney just would not stop. And well, what if you don't get papers? How could you do that to your daughter? How could you leave her in that dangerous situation? Don't you love your daughter? And I mean, objecting to this type of questioning from the government attorney doesn't matter. The judge lets it go forward. And eventually the client broke down and said, even if I don't get papers, I will bring my daughter here, because of the guilt and shame that she felt about leaving her daughter behind. So then, in his decision, the judge said that he was setting a higher bond because the woman had admitted that she was willing to break U.S. immigration laws and bring her daughter here. So it's just an example of how willing the government attorneys are to push people and use their emotions and the experiences and trauma that they've had to really break them and try to keep them in detention. So, why is this government response to family detention so harmful? Well, we've talked a little bit about how it's harmful to the individuals themselves. Artesia is located so far from any city that there's very little access to counsel, not to mention the psychological and physical health of the inmates. But not only that, it's really harmful to the United States. So it costs about $260 to $300 to detain an individual each day. So that's a lot of money that our government is spending to detain these people for no reason. It's really contrary to our basic core values as a country when we think about the due process values and just against arbitrary detention that really go to the core of our nation. And lastly, it's contrary to international law and the treaties that we've entered into, our obligations as a country. We've stated that we will allow asylum seekers to come to the United States, yet that isn't exactly happening.
So So there are alternatives to family imprisonment. The main justification that the government uses for holding families in jail is the fear that they are flight risks, meaning that after they're released from the facility, they'll disappear and will fail to show up for future court hearings and pursue their claims. So, besides keeping them in these facilities, which are costing between $250, $300 a day per person, there are other things like unannounced home visits that they could be utilizing, ankle bracelets, in-person reporting, and the difference in cost is absolutely astronomical. We're talking between 17 cents to $17 per person a day for these alternatives, compared to the $300 per person per day in holding this facility. More so, unlike economic migrants, which don't have the same incentives to pursue immigration claims because they have a much less chance of gaining permanent legal status after entering undocumented, these individuals have been shown to have legitimate claims for asylum. So appearing for future court hearings is in their interest. It means that they could obtain a work permit and be able to work. It means that they could potentially obtain permanent legal status to be able to stay here. So it's not the same concern that, that exists when we're talking about other types of migrants.
So currently, like we talked about, the government has opened Dilley, which is kind of their super family immigration detention center. It can hold up to 2,400 individuals. Right now, there are only 200 people being held there, but they estimate that it could be full by the end of the spring. And it seems that, as of right now, the government is not planning on moving away from family detention anytime soon. When we were in Artesia, President Obama announced the most recent executive order that came out on November 20th about immigration, and we were all hoping that he would announce an end to family detention because this was supposed to be a temporary measure. When these centers first opened in June 2014, it was supposed to be temporary. It was not supposed to continue. However, it was really the opposite. His executive action only helps people who have been in the United States for at least 5 years, and they have reiterated that their top priority for deportation is recent border arrivals. So people who come here most recently will be the ones that they want to deport the fastest. And that means keeping them in detention for as long as possible until they can deport them.
And so our takeaway from all of this is that there is no valid justification for keeping mothers and their children detained when there are other alternatives that would be more humane and less costly. More so, this experience for us was just kind of shocking. I know for me, I just could never kind of contemplate that there would be such a facility in our country. Seeing children and babies in jail is something that you wouldn't expect to see in the United States, but it very much is the case right now. So I think that this issue is certainly, not going to die down. It's something that we're going to continue hearing about, and I really think that it's, one of the civil human rights issues of our time. We are planning actually to hopefully go back this spring to go to the Dilley Center and volunteer again, but this was just a life-changing experience that we're really fortunate to have had, and it's definitely going to change, what we do in the future for sure. So there's a few different ways that, if anybody's interested, there's a few different ways that you can help, and additional resources for more information. Law students or attorneys who are here, there's always the possibility of volunteering at the center. Having advocates there makes a huge difference in these cases. There's also the possibility of volunteering remotely. A lot of the work can be done from anywhere in the country. So if any attorneys or law students are interested in taking on that kind of work, we're happy to give you more information about it. Students who are here, we strongly recommend involvement with the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic. That's was sort of the driving force for us to even do this trip to begin with. And a lot of our efforts were coordinated through Anna and through the clinic. And these are just some resources that you can go to if you want more information. Feel free to contact any of us. We're happy to talk to you more about our experience or anything else you want to talk about. And thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much to our donors who made this trip possible for us. It really meant a lot for us, and we were just amazed to see the kind of community that we live in here. We just feel very fortunate to have students and faculty and local attorneys to support our efforts. So thank you. Thank you.